Dr. Diane Langberg is a practicing psychologist whose clinical expertise includes 45 years of working with trauma survivors and clergy. She speaks internationally on topics related to trauma, ministry, and the Christian life. She is the director of Diane Langberg, PhD and Associates, a group practice in suburban Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, staffed by Christian psychologists, social workers, and counselors. She is also clinical faculty at Biblical Theological Seminary, where she co-leads the Global Trauma Recovery Institute. Dr. Langberg has authored 4 books, including Counseling Survivors of Sexual Abuse, On the Threshold of Hope, Opening the Door for Healing for Survivors of Sexual Abuse, and Suffering and the Heart of God, How Trauma Destroys and Christ Restores. She's married and has 2 sons, and best of all, she has 4 grandchildren. So would you please welcome Dr. Langberg?
Thank you, Kay. It is a privilege to be here with all of you today. You and I live in confusing, complicated, and threatening times. And if we are honest, we feel vulnerable. Actually, we are vulnerable. Many of us are anxious and depressed and grieving. The end is not in sight. And however some of you have been affected personally, do know that I am keenly aware that I am speaking to an unseen audience, but one full of suffering and uncertainty. And given our topics for today, there are ways in which we might actually add to that burden. For we are looking at domestic abuse and sexual abuse, entering into suffering and great vulnerability and a desperate need for hope. And while we are together, we will turn on the light and we will see things we wish would go away. It is my deep desire that while looking into things we do not want to be true, we will also find comfort and mercy, because staring into dark things has already been done by the one who came to us and bore them all. He is also the one who brings healing to us in seemingly hopeless places. I first of all, as we begin, want you to hear something about who you are before we look at the damage that abuse does to us. Each one of you, no matter your story, each one was tenderly knit together by our Father's hands. There are no exceptions. No damage done to you, no trashing, no ignoring or neglecting can alter that truth. Each of you were deliberately created, and you were each created bearing the image of God in your being. No one else's treatment of you makes you an exception to that eternal truth. So let's look a bit at that image and how it is manifest in us, because to talk about abuse is to talk about human beings. And to truly understand the abuse or misuse of humans, it is crucial that we have a sense of what human is. We have to know something of health, or we cannot assess disease or damage. If we do not grasp the reality, we will not understand the extent of the destruction. We will excuse, minimize, or distort what is in fact crippling, deforming, shattering, and life-destroying. So let's start with some concepts that arose out of my work over the years with trauma victims. The first concept is voice. Trauma or abuse is the experience of the self-silenced. The words, feelings, and thoughts of the victim are irrelevant. Abuse shuts down the victim's ouch. Their safety, their desires are disregarded, whether we're talking about sexual abuse, or a beating, or demeaning, humiliating words. These experiences are diametrically opposed to personhood, to the image of God in human beings. They are a destruction of God's handiwork. Each person is meant to have a self that projects itself out into the world, to have a voice, to have creative expression brought to bear on this world. When you have been brutally beaten or sexually abused, that is crushed. The self is shattered. fractured and silenced, and does not speak who it is out into the world. Voice as God intended it is muted. The second concept is relationship. Humans long for safe relationship. We were created to be in relationship. Abuse violates and shatters relationship. It brings betrayal, fear, humiliation, loss of dignity, and shame. It obliterates safety. Trauma isolates, it endangers, it creates barriers and destroys bonds. Empathy is absent, safety is trashed, connection is severed. Abuse has a profound impact on relationships. In fact, the violation and destruction of relationship during times of great suffering is one of the greatest tragedies of the traumatic experience. The third concept is power. And by that, I mean impact or influence. You and I are meant to have impact, to make things happen. Abuse removes and squashes power. The victim feels useless, powerless, and ineffective, and the loss of dignity and purpose is profound. We are meant to work and have purpose. We are meant to see things change just because we were there. And again, note with me, no matter your history, your wounds, your abilities, or anything else, you were deliberately knit together by the loving hands of our Father. And anytime you or any human is mistreated or demeaned, it wounds you and it wounds the Father's heart. The gift of his creation, born of his heart and mind, is trampled by abuse. All these aspects of person, voice, relationship, and power are evident in healthy human beings. Abuse damages the essence of what it means to be human. Dignity, vibrancy, impact, creativity, producing, all life-bearing things are damaged by abuse. Anything we do in response to such trauma in another needs to be built on the foundation of understanding these human concepts so that we can wisely work in restorative ways with people towards the recovery of that image. Abuse silences voice, it destroys relationship, it crushes power. Obviously, abuse, oppression, and violence, whether carried out by an individual or is the work of a larger system, it results in the destruction of the personhood of humans. Human relationships are meant to nurture, support, and increase flourishing. Damage to personhood through abuse in any circumstances is devastating, and it is also against our God. When that abuse occurs in a home or in a church, it not only damages the occupants, but as research has made very clear, it is destructive to future generations. Our word for abuse comes from a Latin word, abutor, and it means basically to use wrongly. Other definitions are insult, consume, violate, defile, tread underfoot, or tarnish. Abuse occurs when one person uses another person for wrong purposes. Anytime someone uses another as a punching bag, a depository for rage, or a thing to be controlled or used for their own gratification, abuse has occurred. Anytime words are used that demean, tarnish, insult, or degrade, abuse has occurred. Anytime intimidation, threats, deriding, sneering, name-calling, or humiliation is used, abuse has occurred. So let's consider domestic abuse in particular. Most victims of domestic violence are female, though there are certainly male victims as well. Statistically, 30% of the women around the world will experience at least one episode of violence from a husband or a partner. More than 3 women are murdered daily in the US by husbands or boyfriends. pregnant women are more likely to be victims of homicide than any other cause. Domestic abuse is the leading cause of injury in women ages 15 to 44, more than rape, mugging, and car accidents combined. Statistically, it is far more dangerous for a woman to go home than to walk the city streets at night. Why is this so? And why is it that we, the church, are somehow unsure about these things and not sure whether they're actually issues of violence and require a critical response from us? Do we really think, as God's people, that resistance to or exposure of violence in the home is somehow wrong? Is it really possible to use culture, tradition, or faith in God to justify abuse and violence in the home, or to cover up abuse? How is it that we have used God or His Word to sanction something He hates? Would you call it abuse if a man pummeled his wife or grabbed her by the hair and banged her head into the wall or sofa arm? Would you call it abuse to so threaten and intimidate another that they'd never voice a different opinion? Is it abuse if a man ties his wife to the four posters of the marital bed and forces sex on her? Is it abuse to maneuver for power and control by preventing a spouse from having any knowledge about finances or any access to money? Is it abuse to curse at a spouse, to call them names like whore or idiot or tub of lard? Is it abuse when a spouse criticizes everything the other spouse does every day? Their appearance, their parenting, their work, their ideas. Are people in these situations being used wrongly, insulted, tread underfoot, or tarnished? Yes, they are. Are they abused? Yes, they are. So how have we then, in the Christian world, somehow managed to ignore or sanction such things that are utterly against God and mar precious humans created in His image and by His hands? So what do we mean by physical abuse? Well, it would include things like hitting, burning, punching, biting, restraining, scratching, blocking, or beating with an object. Also using the body to threaten, like slamming a fist into a wall or breaking something. It means using physical power in some form to control, manipulate, or intimidate. What do we mean by verbal abuse? Name-calling, demeaning, humiliating, and sneering are all abusive. It means using words to control, manipulate, or intimidate another. And what do we mean by emotional abuse? It is the systematic tearing down of another human being by rejecting, ignoring, terrorizing, humiliating, or corrupting. It is the use of emotional power to control, manipulate, or intimidate. Domestic abuse is essentially a pattern of assaulting, coercing behavior, or a pattern of obsessional controlling behavior. Sometimes it builds up and becomes increasingly severe. So, for example, it might initially be that words are used to threaten and create confusion and fear. Then things like restricting, isolating, and withholding are added. Physical acting out is another level, which means doing damage to other things, again, like punching a hole in the wall. And then physical violence to the spouse. And finally, weapons are added. You get the sense, if you look at that, of how fear and terror build up in the home. That pattern is terrifying at any time. When lockdowns and a virus are roaming, fear increases exponentially, and so does the danger. You can wound a soul by any of these means. The lack of physical marks does not mean that abuse is not occurring. All you have to do is read the accounts of torture in international prisons to get some idea of how humans can be hideously abused without ever touching them. The use of isolation, deprivation, threats, and words to control and confuse another can have devastating effects. And those who have been physically abused just one time become easy prey to being managed by verbal and emotional abuse because the line's already been crossed and they know it could easily be crossed again. Do not dismiss the power or destructive capacity of verbal or emotional abuse. Do not think you cannot harm a soul by words alone. Many souls have been wounded in this manner. And do not think, well, at least he did not hit her. Yes, he did. He just did not use his fists. Statistics tell all of us that these things have increased due to quarantining at home. Those being abused have no respite, like going to work or seeing friends or running errands. Hotlines report many more calls. Please know, if you are in an abusive situation or you know someone who is, hotlines, law enforcement, and other agencies are still working actively. And though courts are closed, it is still possible to obtain a protection from abuse order by the telephone. If you know someone in an abusive situation, you can assume it has gotten worse. Check in with them and ask them just yes or no questions so you do not endanger them in any way by having to speak specifically. And there are many, many ways that churches and Christian organizations can partner with local shelters across the country and the world to provide more resources for victims. Why not call and ask how you might help? Do not pass by. Do go to the other side of the road and learn how to help. Sexual abuse. Someone is sexually assaulted every 2 minutes in this country. So by the time I finish speaking, there will have been about 20 sexual assaults occurring. Child sexual abuse occurs in the lives of 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men before the age of 18. Sex abuse against boys has been called America's hidden epidemic. The average age for sexual abuse to begin is 6 for girls and 10 for boys. The majority of abusers are male. 3 to 9% are female. Please note that means there are female abusers. Most abusers are considerably older, but there is a troubling increase in younger perpetrators. 1 in 5 women in the United States has been raped. 44% of those victims are under 18, and 93% know their attacker. 1 in 5 women are raped during the course of their college years in the United States, and we know that many of these are covered up for the sake of the institution involved. No one listening to me wants their institution or organization to be in the news for the next Larry Nassar or Jerry Sandusky. Yet, we have Christian organizations and churches in the headlines for these very things. Many of you are part of institutions that bear the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his name literally means to be in his character, to look like him. To cover up evil for the sake of an institution is the equivalent of hiding a lump in your body to preserve your life. You stop and think about the statistics regarding sexual abuse in the context of your church or an institution, and you begin to grasp the frequency of victims in our midst. And please, again, do not think these things just happen to females. Male rape occurs all over the world. Boys are raped by the bigger and the stronger, by teachers, by coaches, by pastors, priests, and Boy Scout leaders. And the silence surrounding the abuse of males has left an untold number of them to suffer in silence. 1 out of every 10 rape victims is male. Males 18 to 24 and in college are 5 times more likely to be raped than men in the general population. Victims of rape, both male and female, are 3 times more likely to experience depression, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. Obviously, victims of sexual abuse constitute a very vulnerable population. Though perhaps not always named, it is frequently in the room. It is here today among us as we listen and talk together. It is in our homes, it is in our churches, and it is in our institutions. Sexual abuse is generally defined as any sexual activity, verbal, visual, or physical, engaged in without consent. A child is considered unable to consent due to developmental immaturity and an inability to understand sexual behavior. Sexual abuse happens to vulnerable people. It occurs when someone with power of some kind uses that power to feed off a vulnerable person. So you can be 2 years old, or 20, or 40, or 90. You can be male or female. You can be skilled or unskilled. Humans are easily rendered vulnerable by size and age, by their capacities, by their knowledge, by the level of position, and by their circumstances. Verbal sexual abuse means things like sexual threats, sexual or lewd comments about someone's body, and harassment. Visual sexual abuse means forced viewing or participation in pornography, exhibitionism, and voyeurism. Physical sexual abuse includes things like intercourse, oral sex, sodomy, digital penetration, masturbation in front of the child, or in front of the person, or coerced, a fondling of breasts and genitals. We tend to minimize anything short of a violent rape. And when we do so, we have failed to see what has been done damaging to the other person. It is very important to understand that sexual abuse usually occurs in the context of a relationship between a more powerful person and, for some reason, a more vulnerable one. In the vast majority of cases, the abuser is known to the victim and is someone from whom the victim has every right to expect protection and care. If you are little and he or she is big, if he or she is CEO and your job is down the ladder, if you are a student and he or she is a teacher or a coach, if the abuser has spiritual authority or position, or greater knowledge, or a higher position of any kind, or greater verbal skills, all of these are scenarios where the more powerful can use the more vulnerable for food. Jesus called them wolves. The experience of sexual abuse changes a person's life. When abuse occurs to a child, the impact can be profound, particularly if the abuser is by a caregiver or is repeated over time. Because you see, a child is in definition in process. They are not fully formed, they're developing, which means they're malleable, like clay. We know that if you take a sapling tree and bend it as it grows, that bending will shape the mature tree it becomes. Children are similar. When a child is being bent in a certain way, the adult they become will be shaped by that bending, the bending of their thoughts, their emotions, their sense of self, their relationships, and their life with God. It is no more effective to walk up to a grown-up and say, "Stop bending that way," than it would be to walk up to a mature tree and say the same thing. Change comes from gently bending into another way over a significant period of time, little by little, so that it is not broken and can begin to straighten. Great patience, gentleness, and perseverance are necessary, Such qualities are Christ-like. Children who experience abuse may become withdrawn and depressed. They may have sleep difficulties or be unable to concentrate. They may seem fearful and anxious. Some children refer back to earlier behavior like bedwetting or thumb sucking. They may also develop a lot of somatic complaints like headaches or GI problems. Please keep in mind that the presence of these symptoms do not mean that a child has been sexually abused. A child can demonstrate all of these same indicators and never have been abused. They are simply possible indicators. Children who are distressed by other things can exhibit exactly the same behaviors. So if a child shows these symptoms, please pay attention. And if a child shows these symptoms, please do not assume you know the reason why. Abuse of any kind has after effects in the life of the victim. Responses differ depending on whether an individual is exposed to a single abusive event versus those exposed to long-standing abuse of multiple types. Duration, frequency, and intensity all affect impact. The sooner the abuse stops and effective help arrives, the better. Humans often respond to abuse by trying to fight or flee. In a very small child, that may be crying or hiding or going silent. In older children or adults, it may be evidenced in a struggle to get away. Some people respond to trauma by freezing in place, and then sadly feel guilty because they did not try to get away. Listen to me, abuse is never the fault of the victim. It is an exposure of the abuser's heart. If abuse is repeated and efforts to fight it or escape are ineffective, the victim continues to feel more powerless and helpless. This is exacerbated many times when a victim tries to get help from someone else, a parent, a teacher, a pastor, and they are not believed and are left in the abusive situation. That reinforces feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and despair, and research shows it increases the damaging impact of the abuse. Many never attempt to tell or get away because of threats or fear and confusion. This also often results in self-blame, based on a lack of understanding about the overwhelming nature of abuse. Please note that in the United States, child abuse is a crime, and a crime needs to be reported to the proper authorities. These are not mistakes. They are crimes, and they do terrible damage to precious lives, and they must be investigated by those who are trained to do so. Untreated abuse can result in physical problems. People sometimes struggle with migraines or GI problems, or repetitive scratching or hair pulling, or sexual disorders, eating disorders, substance abuse. Extreme stress from abuse can harm the development of the nervous and immune systems. Emotional after effects can include anger, fear, and overwhelming grief, and the shame and the guilt that belong to the abuser and not to the victim. Another possibility is emotional numbness. Repeated abuse can cause a victim to learn how to turn off their emotions. It's a way of getting relief when the feelings are intolerable to bear and the situation inescapable. Anxiety, depression, and interpersonal difficulties are common. Abuse damages a person's thinking, for it has been shaped by lies and deceit. Such beliefs as, I am worthless, God is not good, love does not exist, are very strong. And the work of discerning the truth from the lies taught repeatedly is a tremendous job. The confusion is great, especially if the abuser was considered by others to be a, quote, very fine person, or when the scriptures have been used somehow to justify the abusive actions, or when God's people have used scripture to ignore victims and to minimize their cries for help. Problems stemming from the abuse can also reverberate throughout a victim's relationship. Abuse involves betrayal, rejection, humiliation, abandonment, and deceit. Trust seems impossible or stupid. Relationships are invaded by fear. Control seems necessary. Here's something a victim of child abuse said to me: "Trust is really a scary word. It strikes me as a very stupid thing to do. All of the adults in my life either hurt me or ignored the ones who did. I guess I do trust, don't I? I trust that people will hurt me." Spiritually, the effects of abuse are profound as well. The resulting distorted image of God, coupled with a distorted image of the self, create many barriers to experiencing God's love and grace. God is seen as punitive, capricious, indifferent, abandoning, or perhaps dead. The survivor struggles to bring together two irreconcilable realities: God and abuse. You can handle one without the other. You can handle God, but there's no abuse, or abuse and there's no God. But how do you bring together a loving God and abuse? The mind can grasp one or the other, but both at the same time is utterly overwhelming. Sadly, the tragedy of abuse teaches its victims lies about themselves and about the character of God. When we cover it up, you and I have added to the damage. The tentacles of abuse reach into the life of a victim, often infecting every aspect of their lives. The abused individual's psychological adaptations, like emotional numbing or needing always to feel in control, or fear of intimacy, all those things help the victim survive the trauma, but eventually become the very things that damage adult life and relationships. Sexual assault and abuse bring out all sorts of emotions within the Christian community. And we are often largely uncomfortable with those emotions and often condemning. So, for example, sexual violence results in fear. And we say, God has not given us a spirit of fear. Or it results in anxiety, and we say, you're not supposed to be anxious for anything. Or anger. Don't let the sun don't go down on your anger. Grief. Let not your heart be troubled. Now listen to me, those are very precious scriptures that can be used carefully and over time in lives and be very healing. But I fear that you and I often hurl them like projectiles at the victim in an attempt to make feelings we are uncomfortable with go away as quickly as possible. In essence, we quote these verses not governed by a wise care for those who have been abused, but to silence them, driven by our own discomfort with feelings we would prefer to avoid. If we are to enter into the suffering of those who have been abused, we will have to learn how to sit with and listen to fear, anger, confusion, and great grief over and over again. One of the things that you can do for an abuse survivor who's wrestling with what happened, besides listen carefully and also affirm their great courage for telling the truth, is to treat them as greater than the abuse. Whenever someone is suffering, the church is often very good at circling around them, but sometimes only in relationship to the problem that caused the suffering. They are more than the problem. And I encourage you, as they are able, to include victims in restorative things with you, like go for a walk, or listen to music, or aerobic exercise. We sometimes only relate to suffering people around the suffering, but it is important to relate to them in other ways as well. And the activities that I have just mentioned quiet the mind and rest the body. And the victim is given value and dignity when they have felt trashed for so long. They are given companionship without stress. Doing them with someone who hopes and walks with them, the survivor begins to feel more connected, and that fights against the disconnection that resulted from the abuse. One of the characteristics of dealing with those who have been abused is the repetitious nature of the work. The effects of violence in a life are not remedied by a Bible verse. And again, I am not quite sure where we got the idea that 1 or 2 times quoting something should make someone's struggle go away. Certainly in our own lives, we struggle with things like food, gossip, impatience for a long while. And we often know very well what the scripture says about those things. Human beings are slow to change, all of us, partly because evil and its impact are so much more terrible and deeper than we understand. Are the scriptures important to the healing of victims? Absolutely. But it takes time and many repetitions before the actual truths of the scripture can work their way into a mind that has been filled with deceptions and devastated by the evil of abuse. And those scriptures need to first be incarnated by you and by me. The words need to be made flesh. Not spoken, but lived. And that is our call. Survivors, not unlike those who are grieving, will need to tell the story over and over again, partly just to help them learn how to carry it and to absorb the reality of what happened to them. They will also need those who walk with them to repeat truth and loving assurances again and again, and to live out that truth in the flesh. Dear Church of Jesus Christ, hear me. We do damage to both victims and abusers when we fail to learn how to be a refuge for those who have been victimized and how to be truth and light for those who have abused. We have skated across the surface of some very complicated topics. There is a great deal more to learn. We began with understanding who we are, every one of us, knit together by the hands of the Almighty God, who treasures each of us as individuals and longs for us to treat each other as his great love would treat us. We have not done so. All of us have been hurt and wounded, some very deeply and with long-lasting outcomes. As you consider the places where you have wounded others, unintentionally even, or you remember the places where you have been deeply wounded or despised, remember this: the God who knit you and me, he also became like you and me. He became a vulnerable human knit together by the Father, just like you. And that vulnerable human was hated from the beginning. He had to flee as an immigrant. He was verbally assaulted, despised, sneered at, treated like scum, lacerated, and destroyed. He was silenced, battered, and killed. He was treated like a non-person. He too, like some of you, said, God, why? Why have you abandoned me? The answer he got was silence. This Jesus is with you in your sorrows and your fears. He became like us. He knows. In that becoming, he also demonstrated in the flesh what a human being bearing God's image is to be like. He pursued the vulnerable. He protected the little ones. He poured out compassion on the least of these. Any dismissal of abuse, cover-up, any baptizing of evil, denial of evil is nothing like him. Any discarding of the least of these, the trampling of the vulnerable, is an assault on God himself, no matter the spiritual words we use to excuse our actions. You see, this Jesus had a passion to redeem. For those of you who have been abused and suffering from its debilitating after effects, listen closely. There is hope for you, hope for healing and transformation. I know. I come to you from the front lines, and I've seen it happen countless times. I've had the privilege of working with abuse victims. And I have watched men and women turn to face what they most hear, deal with their symptoms, learn new ways, find freedom from the lies and fears that have strangled them, and experience the love of God as a reality in their lives. Oh, it takes courage. Yes, it does. It is hard work, and there is no quick fix. Such redemption was Jesus' master passion. It mastered everything he did. It is his desire to pursue with his love anything that is lost. Have you lost something? Has something been stolen from you, crushed, taken apart, some piece of who you were? This God came to seek and to save and to redeem what has been lost. What have you lost? Your voice? The truth, drowned out by lies? Your life and its vibrancy and strength and giftedness? Your hope? Not the hope that everything here will be fine. It clearly is not. It is the hope within that waits, because he has said, I am making all things new, and that includes you, every last one of you. Devastation is slowly, bit by bit, redeemable. I know. I have had a front row seat to God's redemptive power for 47 years, and for the record, one of the people he has done redemptive work in is me. My work with victims has taught me, revealed to me who he is. They have been my school, my teachers, and through them I have come to see God more clearly. So evil can be transformed in the life in which it occurred. That work is also redemptive in the life of the one who walks alongside. Evil is then twice crushed. I pray that no matter your story, you will see his story more clearly as he knits patiently, once again, the person that he created you to be. Thank you.